First of all, thank you for coming today, and the ARC group for hosting this panel. How many traveled out of state? Probably a lot. How about within, let's say, California-ish, like left coast kind of stuff? What about non-U.S.? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there's the curler of it. So if we need curling explained, that guy's who we need to talk to. But again, my name is Jeff Shearer. I actually work for SANS Institute. I work as an industrial cybersecurity consultant. I work with their courseware development team. So as you come to school, come to training, I'm one of the people that kind of in the background is working on the courseware. I also work on the ICS Net Wars. Has anybody participated in a Net Wars event where you're trying to capture the flag? Yeah, so it's a capture the flag event, but we're focusing it down into the process control layers and the PLC layers. So I work with those teams to help them. What's interesting maybe about me is I just recently retired, and everybody says, wow, you look too young to retire, and I think they're still looking at that picture versus the gray on my hair.
You got all your money from hacking?
Got all my money from hacking. I make my own bank account go up, so sure. But what's interesting about my career at Rockwell was I did a bunch of things. I did everything from firmware development, software development, moved off into I understood network stacks, so I worked with our network and security groups. And that's sort of interesting, but what was interesting about this panel was being able to work with a lot of different industries trying to get either compliance or audits, their own audits actually achieved. So worked with folks in the NERC SIP arena, worked with water, wastewater, worked with tunnels and bridges and that kind of infrastructure. So that's a little bit about me. And Nathan hit on something that I really hope we take away is that we're going to need to focus down lower in the layers of the Purdue Model, which we're going to discuss. Everybody familiar with the Purdue Model before I go on? So it's the abstraction of factory and automation. So I always see these.
How many agree with the Purdue Model?
Yeah, it's a popular thing. It's like it's one of those things that'll survive nuclear holocaust, that and cockroaches, I think. So, but every time I go to one of these, whether it's a security or automation, there's normally people talking about trends. And I always kind of step back and I say, what are we supposed to learn about trends? And normally what you find is the folks who are talking about the trends are either someone within a company, somebody within an industry that are kind of working on what's the problem and how do we solve it. And then they come to these kind of shows and they tell you about the trends that they're working on, and hopefully we glean from them some kind of inspiration or some kind of model where we can actually have a behavior of adoption. So the unfortunate problem is that when we see trends, we don't normally or necessarily, especially in the industrial space, adopt them quickly. So the question is why are some companies actually leading the charge, and why are some companies actually what I would call laggards? So I think you have to understand yourself first before you can understand how other people behave. And so this is kind of a famous model with Geoffrey Moore. So how many have read the Geoffrey Moore Crossing the Chasm book? So everybody has, that's good. So if you didn't raise your hand, feel bad. So not really. What's interesting about the Geoffrey Moore model is it talks about why people adopt technology. So on the very left-hand side, there's innovators. So you probably know this in your family or have somebody that you'll know and love, that they're going to buy the newest gadget regardless of what it actually does, what problem it solved. The next left-hand quadrant is the early adopters. So those are people who are going to buy technologies to solve a very specific problem. They know it might not be quite solid, but it solves a problem, gets them into maybe a competitive advantage. So they'll adopt. And then there's this thing called the chasm. And the chasm exists between folks who have a specific problem that they want to solve, and then the next is the early majority, which is saying, I have to have some very successful implementations with major companies kind of showing the way before I actually adopt it. It was funny, last night ARC put on the have a drink, have a sandwich, and invite yourself to talk to a lot of people. And if you know me, I'm not embarrassed to talk to anyone, but what I heard last night was there were a lot of people who saying, the research is done, why aren't we adopting it? And I say, hey, have you ever read that Jeffrey Moore book? So what I view these panelists as, they're kind of the chasm crossers. So nuclear energy and power adoption show us success stories for how we can actually look at cybersecurity and actually bring that back to our companies and foster adoption. So there's examples all the time of trend makers that either are adopted very quickly or adopted very slowly. So the first example that I bring is for the investor community, there's these institutional investors. And if you could have a chart, which doesn't really exist, you would find that the professional investors or the professionals that look at this each and every day, that look at this problem, they swing their money from the banks, from insurance agents, so on and so forth. And if you can kind of swing in with them, you get the advantage and the leverage of people and companies who are spending the time to research and actually put their money where their mouth is. So this is a trend, a good trend that you can follow and actually do investment guiding through. The fellows up here and the ladies in the audience, this actually represents from, let's say, the NERC-CIP perspective. They're kind of the professionals that have thought about this for a really long time, and then the rest of us in industry are kind of looking at their bodies of work and saying they've spent a lot of time looking at what problems should we solve and giving recommendations and guidelines. They won't tell you exactly put this widget here and hook it this way to solve the problem, but they are leading indicators much like the industrial or institutional investors. Companies have different products and solutions. So if we go to Duke or we go to other electric providers that I've been involved with, because they don't have the exact same equipment, they come up with different solutions. But there's a thread here that says we're going to meet all of these standards that we're mandated to with these different architectures. So don't feel bad if the playbook isn't completely written, you have to abstract it. Within the industrial security community or even the power community, the adoption rate is longer. So when there was all the buzz about 62443, I looked it up and I'm like, this has to be kind of a misprint because this says 2009. And as you look, some of the early work started back in that, and now vendors are just starting now to catch up with being driven towards something that's standard or that is a guideline that is both vendor has skin in the game and the end user has skin in the game. So why is that? If we look at the IEC 62443, by the way, who's using this as a guideline? Anyone? So we have about 3, okay. So if you look on the right-hand side, there's a vendor responsibility. So vendors are doing secure design life cycles, so they're understanding what their products are doing, and they're explaining it to us how they work. And then all the way out through the left-hand side is implementers and system integrators, how to actually take those products and apply them in a safe manner. So I asked this question before, 62443, I got about 3 hands. Anyone else using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as kind of a guide? So again, not as many as I'd hoped. Are you under any NERC-CIP regulations, or is there a lot of people here in a regulated industry? Couple? Okay. All right. Just trying to get a temperature here of what standards. Anyone else want to volunteer what they're following? Like, is it internal guidelines? Is it something else? API 1164. Anyone else?
IEC 62351.
62351. Okay, cool.
Mainly a smart grid distribution standard.
Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so just trying to get who we're talking to and who's talking to us. So I mentioned that I kind of had a unique career helping many different customers with their regulations and guidelines. It didn't make me an expert on any of them. It just made me go read up and become familiar with them enough to tell them how to apply technology. And there was a common thread through all the standards is that they're trying to make that system very repeatable and understandable. So that is the common thread, and to the depth at which they prescribe what this technology does and how you actually apply it, and then how you secure it, is the beauty of the different standards or guidelines. We see that a lot of times system vendors will, or end users will group these assets together, and they'll call them like a common asset body, or they'll define them as zones of trust. So anybody went through the zones of trust exercises or used the zone of trust? Anybody? So anyway, so a lot of people, when they do criticality of assets, they'll group them together, and then they'll try and say, these things trust those things. And the granularity, it can be normally at the entities or the responsible entities' discretion as to whether they say, as Nathan mentioned, like this device is really important, so it needs its own security or needs to be able to defend itself, versus all the way up through systems. Another trend that I find is that when I go to these security events, a lot of times it's us talking to us. So our challenge here is to really go out and affect change into markets that aren't really thinking about security in the way that this panelist is. So anybody go to the poultry processing show last week like I did? Everybody? Okay, good. Glad to see that. So what's interesting to me is we're worried about keeping the lights on, and we worry less about the food that we stick in our own mouths. So I walked around and I said, hey, I'm Jeff Shearer, I'm a cybersecurity guy, and I get the head bobble sideways looking thing, and I said, like, do you have remote access? What do you do for this? What do you do for that? And it's a complete foreign conversation. So the challenge for us is to get out there and visit poultry plants. Not really. So the changes that we are seeing, or that I'm seeing, is that the people that are involved with security are now coming from the C-level. So we have a thing that Doug Wiley actually kind of turned me on to, is the thing that he's calling the new enterprise. And the new enterprise actually accounts for the C-level people are now being interested in what's happening in production. And so you're going to find more of a strong arm from our higher level players. How many C-level players do we have in the audience? Nobody wants to be picked on, I understand. So no C-level players here, but your job will be to be able to describe to C-level players their responsibility as they go up and down the architecture to secure the devices and to secure the whole entire environment. So this is the Purdue Model. This guy at the end doesn't like it. So how many are familiar with the Purdue Model? Is it pretty much everybody? So it's an abstraction of a factory or automation from the automation point of view. And the point here to make is that if you look in the enterprise and you look at computer resources, there are a lot of training materials and a lot of knowledge, tribal knowledge, whatever you want to call it, on how to secure those kind of devices. What we're seeing at SANS Institute and other industry experts are saying we really need to understand what's happening lower in the architecture. So we need to understand protocol dissection. We need to understand, how does an I/O module get replaced? Is it like the neighborhood watch where I plug something in and I say, that person doesn't belong here, there's some strangeness going on? So we basically, we're finding that we actually need to train lower in the model. So that's it for me. Hopefully this spurred some questions about that layer, and I'll turn it over to Joel.